Once again, thank you all for being here. My name is Dan Traister, and I used to do something or other around this place. And partly because I'm not really staff any longer, I think it's probably permissible for me to start with a small digression, which is to say that those of us who have in the past or recently put up exhibitions and organized conferences know that it's not simply a day at the beach. And I think we really do owe an enormous amount of gratitude towards the work and the intelligence that Lynn Farrington, John Pollock, James Woolley put into the exhibit, and that Lynn, John, James, Tony Bowers, Michael Gamer, and Severe Call put into getting this conference off the ground and as successful as it has been. That it's simply a set of achievements that shouldn't go unrecognized. I want to do one other digression as well, and that is to say that Arch Alias, his name, has been taken on a number of occasions during these past days, usually with great affection. But I want to add that he's often referred to as an independent scholar. And I find that kind of statement just a tad odd for somebody whose doctorate dealt with Swift and came from some fly-by-night institution in New Haven, Connecticut. It's not exactly the amateur's night out when Arch became interested in and continued to work on Swift. And I think it's important to recognize how professionally and how exhaustively trained he was in an institution, incidentally, which he liked at least as much as my wife did, which was not very much at all. But that is another story. There's an enormous amount to be said about Arch, and I'm not going to try to say it here. What I will say is that one of the things that makes this Swift collection as extraordinary as it is the donation that Arch made to it. And for that donation, the debt we owe not only to Arch, but to Carton Rogers, who is not here, but is the director of this library, also needs to be recognized. Carton's predecessor came extremely close to queering the deal, and Carton made up for that in an enormous number of different ways. We owe Carton that kind of debt, and it's probably worth pointing out. I'm not privileged to make the complete announcement, but there will be another fairly large 18th century gift coming to this institution sometime in the near future. And for that, too, Carton's leadership of a library whose parts he has valued highly since beginning here as a youngster in the 1970s is simply incalculably large. And we owe him, even in his absence, an enormous vote of thanks for what it is we're able to use today for Swift and for a lot of other things in this department. Those things are things that a librarian needs to recognize, but I think that a library's users need to recognize them too. I'm simply going to assume that most of us can read, and therefore there's very little need for me to rehash either Ian or Steve's CVs, which you have in front of you. What I will say is simply that both Ian and Steve have been wandering about this library since they were wee slips of lads. And now they are not wee slips of lads. So it's a pleasure to see them back. Ian, Steve.
So first, I would like to thank Lynn Farrington and the other organizers of this conference for including me on this panel, thereby helping me, along with James Woolley and Melinda Rabb, to complete the Swift Triple Crown by presenting at 3 different Swift conferences in a 12-month period, starting in Dublin and in Munster and now in Philadelphia. I'm also grateful to be back at the 6th floor of the Van Pelt Library, where I had an especially formative week-long research visit as a graduate student in the previous century. When I first met Dan Traister and John Pollock, during that visit, I stayed at the Divine Tracy Hotel for less than $100 in cash for the whole week. So the Sheraton is quite the upgrade. My remarks today are concerned with Swift, but not only with Swift, for I'm interested in the broader and little-studied phenomenon of private printing. By private printing, I refer to texts set in type and printed on a press, but not marketed or sold by a bookseller or others commonly employed by the book trade, and instead given away, often in a surreptitious manner. Perhaps a term such as private distribution of print is more appropriate. I'm interested in how this process worked, what purposes it served, and how it can illuminate the practices of writers and readers in Swift's era. I'll begin with Swift's controversial poem that he wrote in late December 1711 entitled The Windsor Prophecy. This is the pen copy used in the exhibit. Swift wrote this poem at a precarious time for the Oxford ministry, which was focused on ending the War of the Spanish Succession. Swift had just published The Conduct of the Allies, the major pamphlet promoting the ministry's peace policy, but he began to suspect that the Queen's support was wavering, and that owing to the Duchess of Somerset's influence, that the Queen was poised to remove the Earl of Oxford as Lord Treasurer. Seeking to discredit the Duchess of Somerset, Swift wrote this libel, which implicated her in the assassination of her second husband 29 years earlier, and suggested that she would poison Queen Anne. As it turned out, Swift's inflammatory poem was unnecessary. The Queen was fully committed to the peace and to Oxford, which incidentally shows how little knowledge Swift had about the inner workings of the court and ministry that he wrote in support of. We know a great deal about the early circulation of the Windsor Prophecy thanks to the nearly day-by-day account in the journal De Stella. Swift wrote on December 24, 1711, that the poem was printed and will be published after Christmas Day. I like it mightily. I don't know how it will pass. But during this delay between printing and publication, Swift was warned off by Abigail Masham, one of his sources for court information. The day after Christmas, she called on Swift and desired me not to let the prophecy be published for fear of angering the Queen about the Duchess of Somerset. So I writ to the printer to stop them. They have been printed and given about, but not sold. On December 27, at a gathering of the Brothers Society, Swift learned that the printer, almost certainly John Barber, had not received my letter, and so he brought us dozens apiece of the prophecy, but I ordered him to part with no more. 'Tis an admirable good one, and people are mad for it. Then on January 4, Swift reiterated that the poem is not published here, only printed copies given to friends. Swift's claims that he tried to halt publication have been treated skeptically by scholars such as Harold Williams, David Foxon, and Pat Rogers. But in doing so, they appear to ignore Swift's repeated distinction between printing and publication, between the technological acts that create printed texts on paper and the practices of distribution that usually involve an economic exchange. As we see here, there is no name or address to identify a printer, bookseller, or distributor. As is appropriate for a surreptitious, scandalous poem, there are multiple layers of anonymity to protect all those involved. We can make some reasonable conjectures about what happened after the poem's initial printing. One of the copies that Barber printed seems to have been used as the basis for another edition, presumably in London. Foxon refers to this other edition as probably a piracy, and he is right to be tentative. It may well have been approved by Barber. This other edition is a close reprinting of the first. The prose preface, for example, has the same line breaks. That it is a different edition, that is a different setting of type, is clear enough when you see that different typefaces were used, as can be discerned by comparing, for example, the Roman capital G and the black letter capital T. Swift's poem prompted a like-minded and similarly titled poem, The Oxford Prophecy, foretelling the late sudden change at court, which also has a similar imprint. Perhaps this poem was also privately distributed. The unknown author of The Oxford Prophecy had clearly read Swift's Windsor Prophecy, but not everyone did. One imagines that once word spread about a libelous poem that was not widely available, there was an unsatisfied demand for it. Swift himself wrote that people are mad for his poem. This might explain why someone reprinted a 3-year-old poem by William Pittis, formerly entitled The Way of the World, or A Tale of a Disbanded Courtier, but now retitled and reissued as The Windsor Prophecy. Pittis's poem has otherwise no connection to Swift's, and to anyone remotely familiar with a genuine poem, it's an obvious imposture. There is no prose preface and no use of black letter, and even at first glance, it's obviously a completely different poem. And there's a further difference, as can be seen in the lower right corner of this half sheet, that it was sold for 1 penny. The William Pittis Windsor Prophecy, in turn, prompted another poem, The Windsor Prophecy Found in a Marlborough Rock. The item on the right is the pen copy, also on display in the exhibit, though I don't think this is a parody of Swift's poem. Rather, it reworks the contents of Pittis's poem to support the Queen's peace policy. So to keep score, that's 3 Windsor prophecies and 1 Oxford prophecy. All 4 have similar imprints, and only one, Pittis's Windsor Prophecy, gives any indication that it was sold. But a variant imprint of the Windsor Prophecy Found in a Marlborough Rock also mentions the price of 1 penny, which in turn raises the possibility of a lost variant imprint of the Pittis poem with no price, which in turn raises the possibility that all 4 poems were at one time privately distributed. Swift provides another instance of private distribution in which printed copies passed from hand to hand, though this time not in the role of author, but of reader. On March 23, 1713, more than a year after writing the Windsor Prophecy, Swift writes in the Journal de Stella, here is the cursedest libel in verse come out that ever was seen, called The Ambassadress. It is very dull, too. It has been printed in 3 or 4 different ways and is handed about but not sold. It abuses the Queen horribly. Swift is referring to the British ambassadress's speech to the French king, which not only attacks the peace, it also accuses Queen Anne of secretly conspiring with the King of France in support of the Pretender. Swift states that the poem was printed in 3 or 4 different ways, though we know of only 2 nearly identical editions, both of them quarter sheets or slips. In this reproduction from Echo, you can see the thin and long shape to these slips. There was in fact a trend in using slips for political satire in 1712, a trend explained by David Fawkson as a way to evade the halfpenny stamp tax that applied to half-sheet printings starting in August 1712. Soon after Swift recorded his comment, the authorities took action. An informant, known only as R.W., wrote to the Earl of Oxford on March 25, enclosing a printed copy of this poem and providing the information that it is being dispersed by one Robbins, a shoemaker in Bell Yard near Temple Bar. This Robbins then probably informed on the printer or one of the printers. There may have been several. One printer was identified as William Hart, and on June 27, he was tried in the Court of Queen's Bench and was sentenced to stand twice in the pillory, to pay a fine of £50, and to be imprisoned for 2 years till he should pay the fine. Speculation arose around this time that Daniel Defoe was the poem's author, an accusation he vehemently denied in his periodical, The Review, on May 7. His denial has been accepted by scholars, and the poem's author remains unknown. In the case of this poem, printed copies were probably difficult to come by, and were certainly dangerous to distribute. This may explain why only 2 copies each of the 2 slip editions survive, as compared to at least 27 contemporaneous manuscripts, all deriving from one of the printed editions. This interconnected relationship between print and manuscript does not stop there, since one of the places the poem was written was on the end papers of a printed book, specifically a copy of a 1716 Poems on Affairs of State collection, an ongoing series that in its origins derived mainly from surreptitiously circulated manuscript verse. So these 2 poems, the Windsor Prophecy and the British ambassadress's speech to the French king, are similar in that they were not distributed through the normal channels of printed material being sold to customers, whether in a bookshop or on the street. Possibly John Barber helped distribute the Windsor Prophecy, but apparently he did not sell it or have it sold by someone else. I don't know anything about the shoemaker named Robbins who distributed the British ambassador's speech to the French king, but I'm guessing that after the trouble he found himself in, he probably stuck to shoes. An important difference between the 2 poems is that one was written by a ministry insider, the other by a ministry outsider with no protection. Hence, there were no arrests in the case of the Windsor Prophecy, though it certainly hurt Swift's standing at court. In other instances, a poem was set in type, printed for private distribution, and then reissued for sale after adjusting the imprint. Here are the reverse sides of 2 copies of the Fable of the Widow and Her Cat, a January 1712 satire on the recently dismissed Duke of Marlborough that is possibly by Swift. They are from the same setting of type, with the only difference in the colophon. The same pattern is evident in another satire on Marlborough printed the following month, entitled The Fable of Midas. This poem is definitely by Swift, and again we find the same setting of type with the variant colophon. Here the privately distributed copy states 1711, using the year as beginning on March 25. Both of the published versions bear the name of John Morphew, the prominent trade publisher who distributed many of Swift's Tory writings during Queen Anne's reign. As a trade publisher, Morphew's role was to distribute such material for a fee while serving as a screen for the copy-owning bookseller or printer, and thus as a double screen for the author. This strategy proved effective when Morphew was summoned by Lord Chief Justice Macclesfield to identify the author of the conduct of the Allies. But Morphew never interacted with Swift directly. Rather, the bookseller Benjamin Tooke or the printer John Barber did. Morphew was paid to be strategically ignorant, as when he was reported to have given evidence in 1714 that it is a very usual thing for persons to leave books and papers at his house and at the houses of other publishers, and a long time after, to call for the value thereof without making themselves known to the said publishers. And if the government makes inquiry concerning the authors of any books or papers so left, in order to bring them to punishment, it often happens that nobody comes to make any demand for the value of the said book. For both the Fable of the Widow Under Cat and the Fable of Midas, it's likely that the poems were kept in standing type while the privately printed versions were being read to and otherwise shared with those close to the author. This situation would allow the author the opportunity to adjust the text in response to suggestions, though we have no evidence of changes made in type for these two examples. We do know that Swift shared a pre-publication version of the Fable of Midas with Lady Masham, the Earl of Oxford, Henry St. John, and other Tories, all of whom approved of it, as he boasted to Esther Johnson. My examples have been from political writings during the last 4 years of Queen Anne's reign, a period when Swift was in London and in close contact with his bookseller and printer. Because they had many opportunities to meet and make arrangements, it makes sense that we find strategic use of the private distribution of print, sometimes as an alternative to regular publishing and sometimes as preparatory to it. Another instance of private distribution of a printed poem happened later in Swift's career with The Journal, the poem he wrote recounting an enjoyable summer stay with the Rocheforts at Goldstein. We know from an account in the London paper, the Whitehall Journal, that Swift's poem was handed about privately in print. This was most likely done without Swift's involvement. As we see here, there is no imprint at all, no city, no date, no name of anyone associated with the poem's production, and no price. Once I became aware of this pattern of printed texts that circulated privately, I started finding references to them more and more often. Usually someone commented that a printed work was handed about or privately handed about, sometimes also clarifying that the item was neither advertised nor sold. Sometimes more detail was added about how it was distributed, such as being left at particular coffee houses and taverns, or thrown into coaches. The language used in each description suggests a recognizable pattern of behavior rather than a unique event. By aligning these kinds of first-person accounts with patterns in imprints that I've presented, we begin to glimpse ways in which readers in Swift's day interacted with print in a far more diverse way than I think many of us have considered. We have become aware, thanks to the pioneering scholarship of Harold Love, Margaret J.M. Mazel, and others, of the ways in which some manuscript texts circulated so widely that we consider them to have been published. That is, we have come to appreciate in this period the ways in which manuscript had a public aspect. Today, I'm asking us to also consider the ways in which print had a private one. In these instances, we appear to be dealing with printings financed by the author or someone not in the book trade, printed in small numbers of copies, probably with the type distributed immediately after printing, and with directions for the work to be given away in a limited manner outside the normal networks of the book trade. Imprints, if they appear at all, provide barely any information, certainly nothing explicit to aid someone trying to find a copy or identify those responsible. How would a reader find these works? Through an acquaintance or word of mouth? In some cases, it's possible that the text would find the readers as a consequence of someone leaving copies in especially strategic locations. Clearly, more work needs to be done on this topic, and I feel as if I'm only beginning to understand it. I want to encourage scholars to think about this further, to work toward developing a more finely tuned vocabulary for talking about printing and publication in this period, to consider the distinction between those two practices, and to think about multiple circuits of distribution. Thinking further about this set of related topics encourages us to read and interpret not only the contents of the works we study, but also the imprints of their original editions. This requires consulting directly these original editions, and therefore returning again and again to superb special collections rooms such as the Kislak Center. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Lynn and her colleagues for giving me an excuse to return once again to Penn, the place where I first discovered bibliography and book history as a precocious junior way back in the early 1990s. And then it took me all of my courage to come up to the 6th floor to, in that case, look for books in the Furness Library. And I remember carpet, a lot of dark wood, and a lot of books. I'm an editor, ergo I must emend. And while this emendation does, I hope, mitigate the otherwise unnecessarily grandiose nature of my title, this is still, I'm afraid, a talk about editing, which means to draw on Pope's famous passive-aggressive characterization of editing. You're in for 20 minutes of dullness, during which I will religiously abhor all innovation and avoid any indulgence of my private sense or conjecture. As you all know, Swift's works have been edited many, many times, from Faulkner in Swift's own lifetime to Dean Swift, Hawkesworth, Nichols, later in the same century, to the Scotts of the 19th and into the early 20th century, to Davis Williams in the 20th, and as well as many others who have edited single works or groups of his writings. And most recently, of course, the Cambridge edition of the works of Jonathan Swift has assembled its own team of editors, some of whom are obviously here today. Collections of Swift's works from Faulkner onwards have always included Swift's non-literary writings, that is, most notably his political and religious writings, alongside the more famous literary works. And the texts of those non-literary, again, inverted commas, works have been treated by their editors, broadly speaking, in much the same way as everything else. So, for example, if one browses the back of the volumes edited by Herbert Davis, you'll see the same kinds of textual information, the same kinds of apparatus, collation tables and so on across the works as a whole. And that editorial consistency is obviously to be applauded, and indeed is repeated in the Cambridge edition, which provides very full textual descriptions and analysis of every work regardless of its literary status. Multiple editions and copies examined and compared, leaves and typefaces measured, catchwords and hyphens noted. Where the Cambridge edition does differ from previous editions, though, is in the advice that it gives in identifying a copy text, that is the most authoritative surviving textual witness. And this is the textual policy as it appears in the general editor's preface. The choice of the version to be printed will be based on an assessment of the work's nature and the particularities of its history. As a general rule, the last authoritative version of the work will be chosen, but in the case of works that are bound in tightly to an immediate context of controversy, polemical tracts, for example, the first edition will usually be chosen instead. And what I want to do today is talk briefly about 4 of Swift's works that most definitely can be described as bound in tightly to an immediate context of controversy, and how the experience of applying this particular editorial policy in practice not only was challenging, but also raised questions about some of the more fundamental aspects of editorial theory regarding authorship, attribution, intentionality, and even the very concept of an edition. And there's some elements here that will link directly with what Steve's just talked about. But first, let's meet the texts. They all belong to the period 1711 to 14, all appeared anonymously without Swift's name, and all were products of his employment by Robert Harley on behalf of the Tory ministry. The first, up here, is in some ways one of the most powerful and popular works that Swift ever wrote, a stinging attack on England, and particularly the Duke of Marlborough's involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession, the conduct of the Allies, was published in late 1711, sold over 11,000 copies in 2 months, and helped turn public opinion decisively against continuing that conflict. And you see a copy of this work in the exhibition. A few weeks before this work was published, Swift complained how troublesome it was to keep sending drafts to, quote, 3 or 4 great people to see that there are no mistakes in point of fact, and one of those must have been Harley. Moreover, Swift was having to spend extended periods of time at the printing house of John Barber, who was printing and publishing this particular work. Conduct appeared as a 96-page octavo pamphlet and became almost literally an overnight success. The first edition was sold out in 2 days, the first edition was sold out in 2 days. As Barber made urgent plans for a new edition, Harley made, as Swift said, 1 or 2 smaller additions. Further revisions came from Harley a few days later, as now a 3rd edition was in the press, and 8 days after Conduct's first publication, a 4th edition was in the press, which would again have amendments from Harley. As Swift himself later wrote, "I stopped the 2nd edition and made all possible inquiries amongst those who I thought could best inform me in order to correct any error I could hear of. I did the same to the 3rd and 4th editions and then left the printer to his liberty." An examination of these 4 editions confirms Swift's claim. Each edition offers a slightly revised text. And then there were further editions, a 5th in December, a 6th in January, a 7th later that year, and an 8th in 1713. And reprint editions also appeared in Edinburgh and Dublin, translated editions in France and Spain. The 2nd and 3rd texts I want to consider today are amongst the shortest works that are included in the Cambridge edition. The Vote of Thanks and the Humble Address, published by the House of Lords on the 9th and 11th of April 1713, respectively, in response to the Queen's speech opening that parliamentary session. Such texts were standard parliamentary practice and indeed remain so. The House of Lords continues to issue versions of these texts after every Queen's speech. Ostensibly, then, the author of both these texts was the House of Lords, as constituted in April 1713, but in practice, these texts were prepared in advance. And manuscripts for these particular texts survive in Swift's hands amongst Harley's own papers. A month before the Queen's speech, Swift had reported that he had, quote, penned the vote of address of thanks for the speech. A week or so later, he noted that he had ready what Harley wanted, but that the prorogation of Parliament meant that I must keep what I have till next week, for I believe he will not see it till just the evening before the session. As the date of the Queen's speech loomed, the business was put off till tomorrow, and it was only the night before the speech itself that Swift finally completed the business I had for him to his satisfaction. It's not entirely clear what the business was, but it is most likely that this was the text of the address itself. The vote of thanks was agreed by the Lords on the 9th of April, immediately after the speech, and a committee of the Lords was duly formed to prepare the address. And that text was presented to the Lords on the 10th of April for approval and formally presented to Anne on the 11th. So that's text 1, 2, and 3. My final text, which again appears in the exhibition here, is The Public Spirit of the Whigs, Swift's riposte to Richard Steele and his pamphlet on the Hanoverian succession called The Crisis. This 48-page quarto pamphlet was first advertised in January 1714, but publication was held back to coincide with the anticipated date of the Queen's speech of that year. Once published, Public Spirit went through successive editions relatively quickly, although not as rapidly as Conduct, with a 4th edition appearing within a matter of weeks. Of the works that I'm talking about this morning, this was the most contentious, thanks to a somewhat ill-advised passage regarding the Act of Union between England and Scotland. And within a few days of its publication, Barber, the printer, was arrested on the orders of John Erskine, the Earl of Mar and Secretary of State for Scotland, on the grounds that the pamphlet is found to contain several passages highly reflecting on Her Majesty's administration and tending to create uneasiness in the minds of Her Majesty's subjects in both parts of the kingdoms, particularly in the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th pages. I'd like you to make mental note of those. A day later, the public spirit was denounced in the House of Lords as a false, malicious, and factious libel, highly dishonourable and scandalous to the Scotch nation, tending to the destruction of the Constitution and most injurious to Her Majesty. And that was Lord Wharton, a Whig who'd been instrumental in the negotiations over the Act of Union. And the House of Lords offered a reward for the identification of the pamphlet's author. So I'm about halfway through now. And so, having introduced the four texts, I want to turn to the challenges of actually applying an editorial policy, our editorial policy, to these works. Remember, in the case of works that are bound in tightly to an immediate context of controversy, the first edition will usually be chosen. So, Conduct of the Allies. 4 editions in less than 2 weeks, 6 editions in less than 2 months. So the decision then is, do we go with the first edition that appeared on the 27th of November, or do any of the subsequent editions claim greater authority? Now, as we've seen, Swift said he kept revising the text up to the 4th edition that appeared around the 5th of December. Now, the dizzying speed with which these editions appeared, and I've only given you highlights of that, but it's extraordinary what kind of pressure the printing house was under in these days. And the intensity of Swift's involvement, who was back and forth to the printing house on pretty much a daily basis. That means that we can argue that these first 4 editions constitute a single textual moment. And for that reason, we can make the case for choosing the 4th edition, representing that first edition in its final form as the copy text, which is in fact what we did. And I think that's a defensible editorial position on its own terms, but the situation is in fact more complicated because actually what you're looking at are not 4 editions. Not in the sense that modern scholars understand editions. And we've long known that in this period and earlier, printers and publishers saw the term edition as an elastic one. It might appear, for example, on the title page, on a new title page attached to otherwise unchanged printed sheets as a way of shifting unsold stock under the pretense of the work being a revised edition. Bibliographers, though, bless us, prefer a more fixed definition. And here we go to Fredson. An edition is the whole number of copies of a book printed at any time or times from, this is my emphasis, substantially the same setting of type pages. In other words, whenever a work is substantially reset, even if the compositors make it look almost identical to the earlier version, it is a new edition by this definition. And it is a definition that I think most literary editors understand and are comfortable with. And for many literary works, this can be applied without too much fuss. But the Conduct of the Allies show that this definition has genuine shortcomings. So the 4th edition, as advertised on the title page, is in fact a composite of type set for the previous 3 editions. In order to meet the immense demand for copies and to incorporate changes and new material from Swift and Harlow, Barber kept much of the text in standing type throughout the 10 days that separated the 4th edition from the 4th edition. And of the 12 forms of type that make up the 4th edition, and a form of type prints one side of a sheet, 2 had first been used to print the 1st edition, both sides of E, but had now been slightly reset, so there have been some minor changes. 4 forms of type, sheets A and B, had been first used to print the 2nd edition. 2 forms, representing sheet E, had first been used to print the 3rd edition, and the remaining forms, for sheets C and D, used type that had been first set for the 2nd and 3rd editions, but then there had been changes that meant that the type had to be reimposed. Now, reimposition is the moving of type around a form. It's the hand press equivalent to cut and paste, which means you get this really strange experience if you've never, if you don't understand how early printing works, where you can have typos across editions that appear on different lines. because they're moving up and down the form. And my favorite typo from the Conduct of the Allowance, which is my favorite typo in the history of all the books I've examined, is from this particular page. And this shows how Swift's intervention and working with the printers is changing the text in unexpected ways. So this page in the second, third, and fourth editions was printed using a form that had been first locked up before 27th of November to make that first edition. And a few days later, that form of type was unlocked and changes were made to the type. And in this particular case, the first 3 lines were moved to the previous page in order to make room for a footnote. But in moving the text up the page, 2 tiny slivers of type at the end of 2 lines, one a hyphen and one a comma, became detached. And any of you who've ever worked with type know how frisky those little pieces of punctuation can be. And when you're working on the text and they drop off, you put them back as you thought they were. But you realize when it gets printed, it's actually the wrong way round. Harley's interventions in Swift text bring us back to the vote of thanks and the humble address of 1713. So they're the 2 there. But if we go back to the address and the vote of thanks and the humble address, here the question is slightly different. To what extent can we attribute works to Swift that were ghosted upon the Lord's behalf, were subject to amendment by Harley, and in the case of the address, by a committee of the Lords, and then whose final texts were recorded on the official parliamentary manuscript rolls and printed by the Queen's printing house without any direct oversight from Swift? Swift himself claims to have penned the vote, and we know he literally did that because the vote appears in his handwriting. But the amendments that appear on that manuscript do not appear in the final version. As for the address, Swift's claims are more circumstantial, although again there is a manuscript in Swift's hands with Harley's annotations. And an earlier draft of that address was printed in Swift's collected works in 1765. Moreover, there are differences between the version that survives in Harley's papers and the official parliamentary version published here. Now, the editorial policy would seem to lead us towards manuscript versions, as they are Swift's holograph, but a strong case can be made that the versions that had the most immediate public relevance and impact should take priority. And in that case, it would be hard to deny the authority of the vote of thanks, as declared by the House of Lords, and the humble address, as published by the Queen's printing house. And consequently, albeit with considerable reservations, this is the 2 texts in the edition I edited that I have really swithered over. Those are the copy texts I chose. However, being read out in the House of Lords is not always evidence for an authoritative version. And you'll remember, Public Spirit of the Whigs, that the offensive passages were pages. So, Lord Wharton wanted to read them. And he took out from his pocket the second edition, where those pages were left out. So he was forced to call to some lords that had the first edition in their pockets. But the thing was, the pages hadn't been so much left out as completely disappeared. What Wharton didn't know was, in fact, that there wasn't just one version of the second edition, but in fact 3 that appeared in rapid succession in the days immediately before and after Barber's arrest. This, on the left, is page 24 from the full second edition, all its page numbers, and a lengthy passage over pages 22, 24 that describes the Scots as, quote, with apologies to at least one Scot in the room, a poor, fierce northern people, and that the union was a marriage to an inferior and penniless woman who had brought with her numerous relations and servants. The Scottish peers were singled out for particular attack as disingenuous and greedy, a burden on the English state and the public purse. I defy any mortal, Swift thunders, to name one single advantage that England could ever expect from such a union. A second version was then produced that replaced these 4 pages with a revised text in which some of the more choice epithets used to describe the Scots were altered, and 2 sentences in the final paragraph were omitted. So you can see here how, though on the left, the text was excised, and then we get that slightly reduced second version. But of course, Marr, in his letter, had identified the whole passage, 22, 23, and 24, so a more drastic solution was required. The whole 3-page passage had to be removed. And so Barber, or if Barber was in prison, his deputies in the printing house, decided against resetting the whole work. Perhaps they didn't want to draw attention to the revision, probably they had many spare sheets available. And so what they did was they removed 8 pages and put back 6. But they kept the title page as the second edition, and they presented the text as otherwise, or not otherwise, as completely unchanged. And that meant pages 22 and 25 disappear, but the text is not disturbed. The flow continues. And we just get, and I sometimes tried this out on undergraduates, I show them that opening, and I'd ask them, what's wrong with that opening? And they will stare at it for hours until I say, how many of you read pages where an odd number is on the left? And given the frequency of mispagination in English books of this period, I suspect few readers realized it was a deliberate error. And just in case you were bibliographically inclined, the printer decided to alter the printing signatures, the little letters at the bottom of the page, carefully enough to suggest that actually the pages, the sheets were still intact. So more than enough to mislead the casual reader, or indeed, for that matter, a 65-year-old peer of the realm. So this expurgated second edition, this third second edition, was then succeeded by a third edition, which was actually the same edition, just with a new title page. And then a fourth edition appeared where the text was reset, but actually all of this was still maintained, all the falsification. So as with the conduct, we have a fourth edition on the title page, which is not a fourth edition in any sense that a bibliographer would recognize. And we have a sequence of editions that show a printing house again working rapidly and intensively to produce multiple printed versions of the text, including changes directly to the typist set. But here, the direction is, as it were, inward. It's to expurgate offensive passages in response to direct state threat. And so, unlike with conduct, here I go with the very first edition as the copy text. So, my brief conclusion, such it is. So these overviews, I think, demonstrate, or I hope demonstrate, the difficulties of applying what seem a straightforward editorial policy to the realities of early 18th century printing house practice, and explain the rationale for what I hope were pragmatically sound decisions. But what really interests me, that they reveal how texts printed to a specific moment could be subject to technical, commercial, and political pressures that are very different to the ones that we generally expect with literary works. The poems that Steve is talking about are a rather different case. But because of that sense of, or the way in which those texts are subject to those particular kinds of pressures, I think that means that we need to perhaps think again about some of the editorial assumptions that we make when it comes to things like attribution, intentionality, authorship, and even the idea of what an edition is. So editing these kind of works on their own terms, which is, I think, what the Cambridge edition is doing for the first time, that means that we need to rethink some of the ways we have traditionally thought about textual production in the early 18th century. Thank you.
I wondered if you could speak a little more about what you're defining as publication. It seemed to me that distinguishing printing from publication in your title elides the fact of distribution, which, as both Swift and you emphasize, was common to in all the cases, right? And the salient difference seems to be whether the published work was sold or just kind of thrown around or given away or whatever. So I wonder why you choose the word publication, and I wondered, you presented this as a project that you're still working on, and if you needed, if you think it would be helpful, maybe people could, in this room, could be useful in thinking about alternatives to that word. Yeah.
Sure. Yes, I am still thinking through it. I think I seized on publication because Swift said that the works were not published, or it said that the Windsor Prophecy was not published, at least in that moment. And so I think I was building off of his apparent distinction, which had been either ignored or sort of treated as a kind of a Swiftian effort to be playful or deceive.
Did you not give examples more than once of places where he said it was printed but not sold?
He said both. Yeah, he said not published and also not sold. That's right.
So published seems to be connected to sold.
Yeah, I mean, publish, there's a definition of to publish in the period that is to make public. So John Morphew, who you saw a number of times in Ian's talk, is referred to frequently as a publisher. And Swift is also referred to as a publisher when he is publishing the works of Temple. So it's a word that has a kind of elasticity. So we would say edited, that Swift edited Temple's works, but on the title page it says published by Jonathan Swift. And the terms frequently about the so-called trade publishers, that's a term coined, I think, really by Mackenzie, but also Treadwell, are the term that they use. Dunton, I believe, uses the term publisher.
Right. So
And he was a distributor.
Is your use of the term? Because I think we have maybe slightly different understandings, and our understandings are maybe built in also to to possible meanings. It's an elastic term, but our more modern, more perhaps narrow understanding is within that elastic term. So I'm really not talking about how did they use the word as much as how are you using the word.
Well, I'm also thinking about the use of the word in the context of the work that Harold Love did on scribal publication. So making it public, making it widely available. And my understanding, at least, of the Windsor Prophecy is that, to some extent, it was not widely available. And I think that explains a little bit of the confusion generated by other poems that were either pretending to be the Windsor Prophecy or responding to the, quote, wrong Windsor Prophecy.
Your idea of publication has a scale built into it, but it's unstated, right? I really feel I need to press you, I want to press you on the use of the word and the way that it resonates with your audience, and what's built into it but not acknowledged in your presentation. So it's just something to think about, that's all.
If I could step in there, I'm someone who's also thought quite a lot about how we use printing and publishing. I mean, and how we use the word edition. I think part of the reason for being cautious about those words is how casually they're used by many scholars, and the assumptions that are built into that anything in print circulated in a marketplace was subject to commercial pressures, whereas printers produced a lot of material, many of which, and if Peter Stalibras was here, he could provide many footnotes for this, a good deal of which was produced for a particular customer as an order, but not for sale. But therefore, the distinction between how public a work is becomes a little trickier. And one of the things I've worked more in the 17th century than the 18th century, parliamentary petitions. You start seeing parliamentary petitions, so petitions to Parliament, starting to appear in print from about the 1620s, 30s, and 40s. And the assumption is often, particularly amongst historians of the Civil War period, that those are public. They're being sold, or they're being widely dispersed. But there is evidence to suggest actually this is just simply a way of being able to make enough copies to be able to give the MPs as they go into Parliament. And I have a sort of heretical hunch, for example, that Milton's Areopagitica, which has remarkably little purchase on wider intellectual debates in the 1640s, is actually one of those texts. And so there I think, I agree that we need to be very careful about how we use the term, but in a sense I'm wanting to say that this is a collective redefinition that we need in terms of the way that previous scholars have often elided print and publication, and it's a lot more kind of spectrum.
Milton being, and historical periods, Milton being so much earlier than what we're talking about with Swift. So it just seems to me that the word needs to be very carefully defined in a historically nuanced way, and I think we're all agreeing to that. Yeah.
Sharif, Michael, and that'll be it.
I was thinking at first that printed not published might have something to do with the Copyright Act 1710, which is the year before the Windsor poem. But it seems to me that it's probably more to do with libel, because you have to have published something in order to fulfill the definition of having libeled somebody. And given the nature of this poem, that might be relevant.
James disagrees a little bit with that.
Yeah, you could do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the crucial thing wouldn't it be that you need someone responsible for having committed the libel, either authoring it or distributing it. I mean, the advantage of having a name on an imprint is that you have someone to arrest or to bully into fingering the person up the chain. I mean, talking before about Barber, Mary Barber, in relation to Epistle to a Lady, she was the last person in this chain and the one right next to Swift, and that's where it stopped because she did not inform on Swift. Matthew Pilkington informed on Barber, and so it continued all the way to her. So, people knew Swift wrote this poem, the people who knew about the poem.
Right, it doesn't matter that
Didn't
he...
have
that
proof that they couldn't, bring forward proof, and they couldn't identify a person who was connected to it, at least in any explicit sense. That's the problem that the Earl of Mar runs into in some ways, right? Because he has the evidence, or he thinks he does, and but of course, Barber in some ways outfoxed him by monkeying with the evidence after the fact,
and claiming that it was the particular text was set by a compositor who worked for them occasionally, but they hadn't seen for a long time.
All I mean to suggest is that he may be operating under a mistaken understanding of what libel means. He would have thought that published is the requirement, the sort of threshold to be guilty of libel, even though all that matters is that you showed it to somebody else. But that might be why he draws the distinction. I don't know, I'm just guessing.
Yeah, I mean, the word is used as just a particular personal satire. A libel is just anything nasty written about another person. So I don't think the legal, I think it's much more of a problem of who is being attacked, and someone very powerful, such as the Duchess of Somerset, is the bigger problem.
Michael, do you want to, as an organizer, I give away the floor to the question. Let me thank everyone for participating.
This gentleman has a question right there. I'm going to ask it. Let's go up 1 minute, Dan. Please.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I just gave the floor to this man. Yeah, go ahead. Otherwise, I do have a question.
It's a question for Ian. I will wait for the mic. Fantastic papers. Thank you so much. I just had a question about what difference it might make to think about certain of Swift's texts as contributions to the history of political thought, and how that might complicate the bounding closely to a controversy, and would seem to be double-edged. I mean, in the case of like Hume's essays or Bolingbroke or something, you might take the last final edited edition, much like you would with a literary work, because it shows a kind of refinement of the blah blah blah, the refinement of the thinking. the conduct of the Allies, people are still reading well into the later 18th centuries and not really caring about the topical controversy, and yet that's crucial to the thinking that's going on. So I just...
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. You put your finger on the difficulty here. I think to defend the Cambridge edition's view on this, I mean, I not only follow the policy, I believe in the policy, which is handy as an editor. The presumption has been that they've thought of it in terms of that that broader, longer-term intellectual impact, and that's how Swift has been read, and that's how Swift, when Faulkner gets him to do whatever revisions he's up to, that's what happens. And there's some of Swift's historical and political works which appear in manuscript or then are returned to much later in his career, and those are slightly different. Here, I think part of what that approach loses, which I think this attention to the earlier edition gains, is it's a little like, it's a version of, or it's a similar kind of debate to the one that has riven Shakespeare scholarship, editorial scholarship, about do we want the Shakespeare on the page or do we want the Shakespeare on the stage? And there's something here that Swift was a really important figure, textually speaking, in that period, 1711 to 1714. And if we indulge the older Swift, we lose the sense of what those, we lose something very valuable about those works. And I even went to the point that I would, I mean, I'm a fairly conservative editor, but I left in stylistic infelicities that were cleared up by Faulkner and others on the grounds that other people reprinted these works at the time, and they didn't care about that. So as much as possible to try and preserve the text as it kind of hit its readership and when it had its maximum impact. So, but that's to say these are important questions, so that they can be you can take different views on that.
This is such great stuff. I want to just keep it going a little longer. I know I'm taking our time, but a little bit to follow up on a couple things, including Tony's starting point. There was a wonderful phrase, Ian, I think in one of your quotes that I'm wondering if I can put back in front of actually both of you, when Swift said, "Then I left the printer to his liberty." And that's among many fascinating things you both said. I mean, what does that mean? What could he mean there? And I guess a more general way of asking this is, both of you, I think, are forcing us to really rethink, the author and the printer, obviously, but maybe in some major ways through your really focused work. And I just wondered if you had any observations on that, kind of curious.
It's a wonderful phrase, and it's that quotation is one that appears in print. So Swift talks about the conduct in print, and it's somewhat different in tone to the language he uses about having to go to the printing house quite as frequently, and so on. And if you read his letters to Esther Johnson in that period, they are just like the kind of emails I get from students just before deadline, complaining about not enough time, I'm so tired, isn't it over already? So there's a certain element of that, but I think there is also, which could be interesting about libel and publishing and so on, that the sense of where sort of textual authority lies, and that idea that, but now I'm leaving it to the printer, and the printer, whatever differences there are now the responsibility of the printer. But so it's a different kind of, it's a really interesting phrase in that way. And I must say, one thing I don't find much in Swift in this period is him claiming about being badly printed. He may be in the with some of his poems and so on, but he seemed he understood and sympathized with printers.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I understood and sympathized, and I think throughout his career, I think there is frequently a tacit understanding, maybe not so tacit, that the risk is on the printers and the booksellers. And so choices about things like censorship, and I think this plays into Gulliver's Travels and other works, if they were to cut material, he didn't seem to get that upset because he understood that they took on the risk and the reward. And so cutting material, if that was their judgment, then I think he was fairly understanding. He gets a bit irate about Gulliver's Travels because they add in material, which he thinks is trash, and he's offended by that. If they had just slashed out or just cut passages, I don't think he would have complained about Mott in the way that he did, but it is the addition of things. And so with poems, you know, on Poetry or Rhapsody or things like that, verses on the Death, I think he sort of said, well, there was a limit to how much they felt they could print safely, and you know, he didn't complain.